Coming up on the Conservationists Assemble, we'll be discussing what makes the Grevy zebra different from other species of zebra. We'll also put the spotlight on what makes the Grevy zebra the most endangered zebra species. You'll learn about how zoos, and one zoo in particular, played a crucial role in preventing near extinction of Grevy zebra. And we'll be providing you with some simple actions you can take to help support the efforts and the future for this species. Welcome, fellow wildlife avengers, to the Conservationists Assemble. My name is Johnny Bloxham, but here I'm known as my alter ego, Captain Conservation, your friendly neighbourhood animal advocate. I am a former zookeeper with a passion for conservation education and the global efforts for threatened species and habitats around the world. I'm inviting you to join me as we take the fight to our planet's biggest villain and my arch nemesis, extinction. Whether you're new to animal advocacy or a veteran in wildlife preservation, this is the podcast for you. Each week, I'll be teaming up with some of Earth's mightiest wildlife heroes to unify the greatest collaboration of conservationists ever known, where we will be discussing our planet's epic species and what is being done to save them. This is the Conservationists Assemble. Will you join the fight? Hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Conservationists Assemble. How have you all been? I very much appreciated the presence of the sun this week. It's still been cold for the most part here in the UK, but the presence of blue skies and the warmth on you at times is pleasant. And also it's a sign that spring is on its way and we'll soon be joined by more colour from the plants and trees and the return of more wildlife after winter. Speaking of being joined, joining me now is Tanya Langenhorst, Grevy Zebra Programme Lead based out of Marwell Zoo in Winchester, England. Tanya, welcome to the Conservationists Assemble. Thank you for teaming up with me today. How are you?
Hello, Johnny. I'm fine. I had a short day so far, but thank you very much for inviting me to this podcast.
It's my absolute pleasure. I think we're going to learn a lot about quite an iconic species, but perhaps one that doesn't necessarily get the attention it deserves. But before we get into the thick of it and discussing the work and collective efforts for Grevy zebra conservation, could you please just introduce yourself in a bit more detail to our listeners?
Yeah, of course. I'm the international stud bookkeeper for Grevy zebras. I record all the data for all the Grevy zebras in the zoos globally, and I record the data in an online database. And then this database can be used by zoo managers and by program managers to manage the population. I'm also the European coordinator for the breeding program in Europe. So I analyze all the data for the European zoo animals, or for the Grevy zebras in the zoos, and I decide who breeds with whom and when and where. So it's a bit like a dating service for Grevy zebras, if you like. That's the easiest way to explain it. So I analyze and check which bloodlines are underrepresented and should breed more, and which have a lot of relatives already and should maybe pause sometimes. And in addition to that, I'm leading our team in Kenya, which works for the conservation of Grevy zebras on the ground.
Fantastic. So quite a mix of kind of in situ and ex situ conservation, and I suppose that's great in terms of showing the marriage between the two.
Yeah.
Now, the Grevy zebra is quite an iconic species. As we've mentioned, most people could identify a zebra should they see one in the wild or walk through a zoo. So aside from the obvious, what are some of the key things about Grevy zebra that we ought to know?
The Grevy zebra are one of three species, and while you think most people can identify a zebra, I don't think most people could identify a Grevy zebra. I reckon most people have never even heard of it. They are the largest of the three zebras. They have the longest gestation period. They're pregnant for over 13 months, whereas all the others are about 11 to 12 months. They have very narrow and thin stripes as opposed to the big, bold black stripes that everybody recognizes on the other zebras. They're by far the most endangered zebra because there is less than 3,000 of them left. And they have enormous round ears. So that's how you can quite easily differentiate between them and the other zebras.
Are they found in a similar environment to other species of zebra, or do they not really mix in the wild?
They are living in very dry areas and semi-arid areas in the far north of Kenya and Ethiopia, whereas the common zebras are more in the southern part of Africa. But there is an area in Kenya where they slightly overlap because over time the Grevy zebras have been forced more south, really, by climate change and threats, etc. So there are areas where they overlap with the common zebra, with the plain zebra.
Sure. So that's quite a kind of a recent transition then that now we have to consider in terms of their conservation.
Yes, because obviously they could hybridize, which would then be a risk to the species even more. Hybridization has been seen in one area, and they're keeping an eye on it. But I think that there was something that Grevy zebra stallions are not interested in hybridized females for some reason. So they don't seem, once they have produced an offspring, that offspring doesn't seem to carry on breeding.
That's quite fortunate then in the grand scheme of things. And just focusing in on the stripes of a zebra, because again, that's probably the first thing that people think of when you mention the species. It's been a kind of a bone of contention as to the function or the purpose of stripes. So is there a definitive benefit or a definitive reason why zebras have
No,
evolved?
there isn't a definitive one. There are different theories. There is a theory that they are appearing in a herd that breaks up the shape of an individual, and therefore it would be very difficult for a predator to pinpoint one individual zebra. There's a theory that it has to do with cooling, because the sun, when it hits the different colored stripes on the black ones, obviously it gets a lot hotter. On the white ones, it gets cooler, and that creates some currents which cools the zebras. Then there's a theory that it confuses some biting insects, but there is no definitive answer. It might be a combination of all of those.
That's really interesting, and all of those would be very clever functions of the stripe. So it's interesting to know to think about what potential benefits come from breeding stripy.
I don't know if or how anybody can say that the definitive,
Absolutely.
because they all make sense.
Yeah, they do. You mentioned predators being one of the potential theories as to why the zebras might have stripes. So what kind of predators are we talking about? Obviously, we quite commonly see lions on documentaries, but are there any other predators that are present?
Well, actually, in the area where the Grevy zebras live these days, there aren't really that many predators left, and the main ones would be lions, yes, but none others really. But that basically there aren't that many left. For example, there's one conservancy in Kenya where they have lions, but they're also very much known for their Grevy zebra population. So that's a bit of a conflict of interest because both species are kind of protected there. So they have to balance that.
Now, the other thing we see when we see zebras on documentaries when they get represented is these vast herds. So can you tell us a bit about the social ecology of the Grevy zebra, please?
Yes, the Grevy zebra has a very different social ecology from all the zebras that you see on the telly, because in the Grevy zebras they don't build these, they don't form harems, which is what you can see on telly. It's usually one stallion with several females, and then they build larger groups. The Grevy zebras, the stallions are territorial, so they hold a territory somewhere, which is very good for grazing or water. And the females move around through the different territories, and there is not even a permanent unit of females. The basic unit is a female with her most recent two foals, possibly, and then they often get together with other females with foals for protection, and they move around together. You also have bachelor males, so the younger males that don't hold a territory yet. They form smaller groups and move around together. And they can even be in the territory of a territorial stallion. As long as there are no females around, he will tolerate them. But then once females turn up, the territorial stallion can mate with them. That's kind of in exchange for him providing food and water, if you like. And so all these groups are really quite loose and can change on a daily or weekly basis.
So yeah, so it's a bit more complex in a sense then, would you say? Or would you say that kind of the difference between social ecologies of species are just complex in different ways?
Yes, I would say there are challenges to both systems because the territorial stallion, he doesn't really have to worry about the group. He worries about his territory. Whereas in the other species where the male has a group of females, he has to defend them and stay with them and all that.
And you mentioned at the beginning that the Grevy zebra has a longer gestation period. Have we seen differences in reproductive biology then that's maybe contributed to the lengthier gestation period?
Not majorly, no. It's the females don't tend to get pregnant if they are in a physically bad state or if the environment isn't very good. So if it's in the middle of a drought, they're very unlikely to get pregnant.
And what role did they play in the wider ecosystem?
Well, before their numbers declined, Grevy zebras would have played a very important role in the biodiversity of the region because they were the most abundant grazing herbivores in the ecosystem. So their impact on the structures and composition of all the rangelands was likely to have been significant. However, since they have declined in numbers, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to analyze or assess their influence on the environment because this will be mostly overshadowed by the fact that there's a long-term impact on the environment by domestic livestock, which grazes in large numbers and has contributed to the decline of habitat. So it's very difficult to then say what the Grevy zebra's contribution is because they're overshadowed by these vast numbers of livestock in certain areas.
In terms of why we're discussing the Grevy zebra, you mentioned that they're more endangered. What is their IUCN Red List and kind of, is the trend still declining or is it stable?
Well, funnily enough, they are on the Red List, they're only endangered, even though there's fewer than 3,000 of them left, which is a lower number than the black rhino, and everybody knows how endangered they are. There used to be about 15,000 in the 1970s, and in Kenya, in Ethiopia, in Somalia, Djibouti, and these days there's really just one stronghold left in Kenya. Less than 200, I would say, possibly way less than 200 in Ethiopia, and that's it. So they're extinct everywhere else, which is why we are working with them in Kenya. And at their lowest point, I think it was about 2004, they even dipped below 2,000 animals. And then all the conservation efforts started in Kenya, and the numbers stabilized somewhat and started to creep up again. And we are coming close to 3,000, well, 2,800 in Kenya and about 200 in Ethiopia. So yeah, numbers were creeping up again. And the last reliable number is from a survey in 2018 where we had 2,800 in Kenya. There have been a few more surveys since, but there's also been a pandemic and an extremely long-lasting drought. And so the data that we collected during the surveys in 2020 and even in 24, so only last year, have not been completely analyzed yet. But we know we saw 2,300 in, well, a year ago, at least. And we know that there have been huge numbers of foals born since the drought a year before. So we are cautiously optimistic that numbers are still okay, and we are obviously carrying on trying to increase numbers again. Yeah, the main threats are the loss of habitat, the habitat degradation, which is greatly caused by the livestock. But also one of the biggest emerging threats is infrastructure development on a grand scale in Kenya. So there are plans to build a corridor from the sea all the way up to South Sudan and to Ethiopia. And that corridor will contain oil pipes, gas pipes, train line, roads, I think some holiday resorts, and they will cut right through the core population of the Grevy zebra. And there's this incredible threat, not just to Grevies, obviously, but to all other wildlife, that the population will be cut in half. So we have put out collars on a group of zebras that live in that area to identify exactly how close they are getting to the corridor, and are there any crossover points that are essential for the population, so that then the Kenya Wildlife Service can work with the developers, and hopefully they will come up with some mitigation things to improve the situation. So, for example, building overpasses or underpasses so that the population can continue to cross over this corridor and are not split in half, because that would make a small population even smaller. And the smaller they are, the more endangered they become, or the more at risk they are from any influence, really.
I think that's a nice segue into the conservation actions on the ground. Who and what are involved in the conservation actions in Kenya?
Well, the Kenya Wildlife Service is the manager, the protector of all wildlife in Kenya, so nothing can happen without their say-so. But back in 2004, when it became clear that the Grevy zebras were in dire need and needed concerted efforts to protect them, there was a task force formed first, which was made up of different organizations that were interested in Grevy zebras, then the people from the different rangelands where the Grevy zebras live, scientists, the Kenya Wildlife Service. Then there was Marwell Zoo came in as well, because we had always been interested in Grevy zebras. And they all came together in this task force and started to bring action on the ground. And this task force was then a little bit later called upon by the Kenya Wildlife Service and was turned into the Grevy Zebra Technical Committee. So it's a committee that sits under KWS, Kenya Wildlife Service, and it's made up of a group of non-governmental organizations, NGOs, who are all interested in Grevy zebra conservation, and they're all working together in order to make sure that efforts are not duplicated, because that would waste people's time, and it would also waste really precious funds. Because obviously, as you can imagine, funding is always a key thing, and it's always hard to come by. And so in 2006, the Grevy Zebra Trust was formed in Kenya. And together with them, Marwell and Grevy Zebra Trust are really the main players in the technical committee and on the ground. And the Grevy Zebra Trust works more in the national reserves, where the core population is, and Marwell works further in the north, where there are fewer zebras, Grevy zebras, but they're quite important because they're a potential link to the Ethiopian population. And so what we are doing is quite similar, but we're doing it in different areas to make sure to cover as vast a range of Grevy zebra as possible without stepping on each other's toes. So we have groups of scouts, teams of scouts that go out on a daily basis on foot patrol, and they have GPS-enabled phones on which they record all wildlife they can see, not just Grevy zebras, but all wildlife. and that then automatically gets transferred to our analyst in Nairobi, and she can analyze all the data that come in, can feed back to the scouts and to our field team. And they also have a network of camera traps, which they put out every night to see and understand what's happening overnight, because a lot of the wildlife, especially the Grevy zebras, approach, for example, water holes at night, because during the day there are often large groups of livestock, and the Grevies would not approach then. So they're coming overnight. And for us to learn what's happening overnight, we need these camera traps.
So since its inception, what are some of the biggest or main areas of focus for the committee in terms of once they've got the information from the surveying, what are they hoping to action?
Well, they actually produced the first ever national strategy for the Grevy zebra and an action plan. So there are vast lists of different action points and who should do them and where and by when, which then gets regularly reviewed to see if action points have been achieved. And every 10 years a new strategy is produced. We are at the moment coming to the end of the current one. The first two strategies were mostly focused on stabilizing the population and then increasing it. And the current one was focused on growth. But then we got hit by these extreme droughts. So at the moment, we're probably more looking at stabilizing again. But also during extreme periods, for example, the drought, the committee comes together and decides to take action. So the Grevy Zebra Trust and Marwell go out and provide hay to the Grevy zebras. And the main aim of that is to keep pregnant females and lactating females going, because otherwise we would lose an entire year of growth. There was also a case in 2006, for example, there was an outbreak of anthrax, which threatened the core population, and we could have lost the species at that point. So the committee discussed that, and the answer was to vaccinate wild Grevy zebras, which is, as you can imagine, a huge undertaking.
Yeah.
And that was made possible because Marwell and the Grevy Zebra Trust went to the zoo world and said, this is happening, we need help. And within 2 weeks, we had huge amounts of money from all the zoos in Europe and in North America. And they did actually manage to vaccinate, I think, over half of the wild population, and that is probably what saved them. Then the committee also organizes on a regular basis a national survey. So originally it was every 2 years, but that is just financially not viable. So now it's more every 3 to 4 years that there's a national survey in Kenya, where on one weekend, the last weekend in January usually, all the organizations that are involved, but also anybody else who wants to get involved, goes out with the camera in certain areas that have been planned for and photograph every zebra, Grevy zebra they can see. And together with, when we have all the pictures together, which can be thousands and thousands and thousands, we can then work out how many Grevy zebras there are, because they have, their stripe patterns are unique to them. So when you look at all the photos and compare them all, you can say, okay, I've seen that zebra already, so I'm not counting it. So you avoid double counting. As you can imagine, that is a huge undertaking to do that by hand. So we do actually have a database for that and a software for that that helps with that.
Oh, that's incredible. Yeah, my first thought was that you must have a really keen eye, because I can imagine that the differences could be very subtle at times.
Yes, yeah. But we use it in the zoo as well. in theory, because in the zoos, for example, all animals have to be electronically chipped. In theory, you don't need that for the Grevy zebras, because if you just take a picture of them, you have a
Sure.
unique passport photo. So yeah, or sometimes if animals turn up in a zoo and we don't know exactly which ones they are, we can look at the photo and identify them. And at some point, we actually, I think in Kenya, we had over 70% of the wild grevies individually identified. That was before the pandemic started and everything kind of went a bit
That's a lot of
downhill.
zebras to be able to identify individually. So that's, yeah, very impressive. So you've got the
Yes.
database that you use to analyze stripe patterns, and obviously the scouts that are working hard on foot daily. But are there any other surveying methods that are utilized?
Um, we would like to start with drones. That is an idea we're having. We just currently have issues getting drones into Kenya and getting permission to use them. But that might be a game changer, because it will be a lot easier to find them in the first place. And it would, once it works, it would make things possibly a bit cheaper as well, because we have had national surveys before where we had support from aeroplanes, and they obviously cost huge amounts of money. Whereas if you have drones, that would be a lot cheaper.
And you mentioned that kind of this current action plan is up for renewal almost soon. So what are some of the future actions that you think might be the next steps of Grevy zebra conservation?
Possibly expanding a little bit where we are monitoring, because there was an article last year saying that some zebras, Grevy zebras, had been seen in woodland in a national park, where certainly I never heard that there were Grevy zebras, and it's highly unusual to have Grevy zebras in a woodland. But we saw the pictures, so that's certainly where we would like to go. And also going further north along Lake Turkana, to the area that links to Ethiopia. And another thing that would be fantastic would be to do another survey in Ethiopia. That's obviously not something that Kenya can influence, but the Ethiopians are always coming to Kenya for advice and are trying to join in and get similar actions off the ground. So expanding the strategy to maybe go over the border even, that would be fantastic.
And so in terms of funding all of this, because like you mentioned how drones would be cheaper than using the planes, for example, what or how can people get involved and support the project? Are there any places that they can look to if they were able to support financially, or how do you go about gaining funds for this program?
Well, because I'm the breeding program coordinator, I report everything from the field back to the zoos, and we have a very loyal supporter base from between 5 and 10 zoos that provide funds every year to make these actions possible. And obviously Marwell does provide a lot of funds as well. They're paying all the people in Kenya, but all the other action is very much supported by the zoos. And the Grevy Zebra Trust, I think, has similar support from North American zoos. But Marwell is this year actually going into a year of fundraising for the Grevy Zebras. So there will be different actions happening. There will be a 10K race in September. There will be a gala dinner in June. And only this morning have we started a Just Giving page, where people, it's mostly for those who want to take part in the 10K race, but it's generally a tool where people can support us. So it's on Just Giving, and if you look for Run for Zebras, then you should come up with that. That would be fantastic, and it doesn't need to be much, you know. In Kenya, every penny goes a very, very long way. So anybody who can give anything would be fantastic.
Again, I was reading the report that you sent through from 2023, and it covers a lot. Like I say, it covers wages for the scouts, it covers tools and devices such as the phones, but also some of the other things that it provides that I found very interesting and quite, I don't know, motivating, inspiring, were kind of the school trips for the students in schools to the Lewa reserve to go and see the Big Five. And it's great that, you know, you hear about these schools where people go in and educate, but to actually take the students out to see them, I found that quite inspiring and a very positive action.
Yeah, and it is a very very efficient thing, because believe it or not, these children live in the middle of nowhere. I mean, in really harsh environments up in the far north of Kenya. And yet many or most of them have never seen wildlife, certainly not close up. And all they've heard about it might be from their parents saying, oh, they're dangerous, they kill our livestock, or they eat our grass or something like that. And then you take these children into conservancies like Lewa, where they get to see wildlife close up, and they're absolutely amazed, because they've never seen a Grevy zebra, they've never seen a buffalo close up, or an elephant, or a giraffe, and they're absolutely fascinated. They also get to meet people who work in conservation on the ground. They get to meet the people who run a vegetable plot, for example, or how to recycle rubbish and stuff. And these kids come back to their own families and schools and are inspired, and they create conservation clubs. They go out and clean up their own village. So litter picking, they want to plant trees, they build bird feeding stations. And one school has even created a little greenhouse or glass house, where the children look after the plants and can then take them home and eat. And it's incredible.
And also a similar concept is with the local warrior communities, where the young males get left to their own devices, in a sense, in terms of their upbringing, and actually they are, or have been found to be, killing zebras for food, and now they're inviting them in a similar fashion to the Conservancy, almost as an investment in the future of the zebras, because those males will go back and lead their communities one day. So by inspiring them to protect nature, it's almost investing in the future of the Grevy zebra.
Yes, that is something we started only last year. There's one group of children called the herders, which is not allowed to go to school because they go out with their family's livestock. So they spend their life walking around trying to find grazing for the livestock. And the warriors that you have mentioned are coming from that group. So they then become teenagers, they're young men, and they go out kind of fending for themselves. And yes, they do kill Grevy zebras, not just for eating them, but for target practice, because it's a bunch of young men, they have nothing else to do, they have a weapon, and so it's kind of entertainment. So and this very much increased during the pandemic, because obviously food was very, very hard to come by in these areas, and poaching increased dramatically. So we thought we have to do something about it. So we are now sending every month, one of our scouts goes out and meets with a group of these warriors to tell them about Grevy zebras and how important they are, how endangered they are, and how important they are for conservation. And that's not just important for the Grevies, but also for their communities, because the community is all supporting our work and the conservation of the wildlife. And these warriors had never heard of that. They were amazed, and they said, "Well, yeah, of course, that's really interesting and important. We will stop killing them if they really will. I don't know. It remains to be seen." And so we thought, well, in that case, why don't we take them and go on these outings like we have for the school children to meet to see wildlife up close and learn about them and their conservation and how important they are and how every single species fits in into the bigger picture. And like you say, they will be the leaders of the future in the same way that all the children will be the conservators of the future. And we need to inspire them to understand how they fit in with their environment, and how they can all benefit from each other and live together for the benefit of the wildlife and the people. And that's why these trips are so amazing and so inspiring.
And I think, on that note, we've really given a great insight into the focus of the Grevy Zebra Technical Committee. So we are just going to switch track now, Tanya, and have a look into your career and your background and how you got to where you are today, sitting as a part of a committee very much at the forefront of Grevy Zebra conservation. So please, just detail how you got to where you are today.
Oh, wow. Well, I always knew I wanted to work with animals. And then, so I studied zoology. I thought that's a good starting point. Then I wanted to work in a zoo because, again, I thought that's a good first thing. I also wanted to learn English because I'm German. So I approached zoos in a whole range of Northern European countries where they all speak English. Or even if that's not their native language, they can speak English, like Scandinavia and Holland. And eventually I got a letter from Marwell saying, well, we can't pay you, but you're welcome to come here and work for us. So I got a stipend from the European Union. At the time, that was still possible. And came over and worked for free for a year in the biology office here at Marwell. Then I decided to stay here in the UK. And moved over. And the first job I could get at Marwell was in reception. I thought, well, at least I'm in the right place. And when the biology office got a new boss, that he said, well, there's a zoologist sitting in reception. Why don't we pull her out of there? So that's how I started in the biology office, which then became the conservation department. And the person who had left behind the Grevy Zebra breeding program and the stud book. So I took over that. That's how I first got involved with the Grevy Zebras. And in 2003, there was a survey of Ethiopia organized by the IUCN coordinator for Grevy Zebras. And he approached Marwell and said, can you give us some money for the survey? And my boss said, yeah, you can have money, but you have to take Tanya with you. So I was packed off onto a plane and found myself in Ethiopia for 7 weeks, together with many other people. And that's how I started in the field. I mean, I was thrown in at the deep end, but yeah, and then it became very clear that the Grevy Zebra was incredibly in dire needs, because in 7 weeks in Ethiopia we saw, I think, 84 Grevies.
Wow.
And we knew already from a previous survey that in Kenya they weren't doing all that well either. And that's how then the first task force was formed. Yeah, and I have been involved ever since. So I used to go out almost every year until Marwell then placed a permanent person in Kenya. And by now we have a group of, there's 2 ladies who run it all, but we have 25 scouts and 3 field assistants. And the 2 ladies, Lisbeth and Rita, one is our project manager and one is our field coordinator, and they're running the show out there. But yeah, I'm kind of their lead and I'm their contact to Marwell.
And in terms of now, obviously having worked around zebra or Grevy zebra conservation for a while, what would you say your favourite thing about a Grevy zebra is? Is there anything that you kind of really enjoy about working around them and for the species?
Well, they're just gorgeous creatures. I mean, if you look at this, the different zebras, they are by far the most elegant one, and they're just beautiful. And they're amazing animals that can go for 3 days without water unless they have a foal. They can walk kilometers and kilometers every day. They are living under the incredibly harshest conditions. And I can't say I work with them because most of my work is done at a computer.
Sure.
But yes, they're a beautiful species and absolutely worth conserving, which is why I do what I do.
Having dedicated a lot of time to the Grevy zebra, are there any other species that you would love to work with or to see in the wild?
Not necessarily to work with, but to see in the wild brown bears.
Yeah.
I did my master's degree in brown bears in zoos, and I've just always had a thing for them ever since. I have seen some in Romania in a set location where they had put out food so that the bears would come. That was a birthday present for me once because I wanted to see brown bears in the wild, and that was the closest we could get to it. But yeah, see them somewhere in Alaska or Canada, that would be just, yeah.
And when you're not fighting extinction by doing the work that you do, how do you unwind?
Some of it you take home with you. If I have issues, for example, in the breeding program, I sometimes when I wake up at night, I think about it. When I potter in the garden, I think about it. And that's how some of the ideas and solutions come to me. I meet up with friends. I do a lot of gardening, and we like to visit gardens. Yeah, or just sit in a nice cafe with a good coffee and a newspaper. That's certainly what does it for me.
And how can our listeners follow your work or the work of organisations involved in the Grevy Zebra Technical Committee?
Well, we are perfectly aware that our website isn't very great at the moment. We are working on that so that all our different projects are showcased much better. But you can already go onto our website at marwell.org.uk/conservation, and under achievements you will find a lot of documents. For example, all the annual reports that I produce for all the zoos, which every year show you what has been done for Grevy zebra conservation in the previous year. So that's really your first port of call. There you can see what has been going on, and there are also the other organizations we work with, and their websites are also in those reports. So that will be a good starting point.
On that note then, do you have any last messages for our listeners?
Well, I would say if you are doing something for conservation, just keep going. I know it's hard at times, but we can't leave it to just the politicians to save the planet. It's really down to every single person. So whatever you can do in your own garden, change your own attitudes, the things you do, even minor things, or if you are working in that field, don't give up. Because if something goes right in conservation, there's no better feeling than that. So just keep going.
That's a lovely point to finish up on. So with that last question, Tanya, thank you so much for teaming up with me on this episode of the Conservationists Assemble. It's been an absolute pleasure to listen to your incredible knowledge on Grevy zebra and your unwavering dedication to ensuring a future for the species. So yeah, we wish you and all of your colleagues continued success going forward, and we look forward to keeping up to date with all the future developments. And of course, a huge shout out to you, my fellow wildlife avengers, for tuning in. If you enjoyed this volume of the podcast and wish to join the fight, please follow, subscribe and rate the podcast wherever you stream from. Please also follow on social media to stay up to date with the podcast's latest developments and share with your family and friends to help stack the odds in conservation's favour. Don't forget you can join the fight by joining the conversation. Share your thoughts and suggestions on this episode, past episodes or future episodes via email or on social media. In the spirit of restoring a widespread disconnect to nature globally, I want to hear from you. If you have happened to snap pictures or videos of Grevy zebra in zoos or in far off lands, if you have any questions about any of the topics in this episode, or you have had an experience with nature, a different species, or just some thoughts about wildlife, then please send any photos, videos, voice notes or questions by email or on social media, which are both linked in the show notes. Check out the links to the Just Giving page and the other fantastic organisations involved with Grevy zebra conservation. Be sure to tune in to the next fantastic episode of the Conservationists Assemble. Until then, this is Captain Conservation signing off, over and out.